Welcome to 'Cause We're Nerds, the podcast that covers trends and new releases in comics, movies, video games, board games, and much more. I'm your host, Zach, and with me is my co-host and cousin, Caleb.
Hey everyone.
Thanks for joining us in our current series, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, where we will be discussing each MCU movie and release order, all leading up to Marvel's Avengers Infinity War coming out next week. With the third installment of The God of Thunder, what changes does this movie make to keep Chris Hemsworth's fifth appearance as Thor fresh? What is Planet Hulk and the Illuminati, and why does it matter? And finally, who really is the strongest Avenger? Find out these questions and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Thor, Ragnarok. So Caleb, you might be wondering how I started 'Cause We're Nerds. You see, I tried to start a podcast, but didn't print enough pamphlets, so hardly anyone listens, except for my mom and her boyfriend, who I hate. Bit of a promotional disaster, that one. But I'm actually organizing another podcast. I don't know if you'd be interested in something like that.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Korg, the best character in this movie by far. All right, Caleb, so Thor Ragnarok, we get a complete tone shift from the first few Thors. I remember after this movie came out, I texted you and I was like thrilled with it. I loved it. And I remember your like text back, you were like, it was decent.
You never have flattering stories to tell of me.
No, sorry.
I think I was probably just adjusting to it, trying to get my head around it. Because this was a big shift. In fact, I know someone that went to see this movie, and they hadn't seen any of the trailers or anything.
Oh, yep.
So they were expecting, like, Thor 1 and 2, and they hated it coming out.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that in the marketing. I think with the trailers and some of the other clips that promotionally they put out, they were prepping audiences for this tone shift. But yeah, if you hadn't seen any of the marketing, you would definitely be a little shocked.
Yeah, living under a rock.
Yeah, pretty much. So we get Taika Waititi here to direct after Kenneth Branagh turned down the role to direct Murder on the Orient Express instead.
Yeah, so Taika, are you familiar with him at all?
You know, I know he directed a movie about vampires. That's about it.
So I wasn't directly familiar with him, but I was familiar with a show that he worked on called Flight of the Conchords. Have you seen it?
Oh, I did not know that he worked on that. I love that show. Yes.
Yeah, so you know Jermaine from that show. He is a very frequent collaborator with him. In fact, he was in a comedy group with him for a little while.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so this guy is, obviously, if you've seen that show, you know that's a New Zealand-style show. This is a New Zealand-style director. He is from New Zealand, and they have a very specific type of comedy, I guess you'd call it. Really quirky, really funny, really dry. And so for him to come onto this movie, he's bringing that with him. And that's why we get a lot of these tonal shifts.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And did you know that he has had some history in superhero movies?
Yes. He was in the much maligned Green Lantern film, 2011.
Yeah, he was Tom Hall Jordan's best friend. And I believe in an interview, or maybe one of the behind the scenes on the Blu-ray, he states how that kind of taught him how not to make a superhero movie.
Yeah, and that's not surprising at all, considering how not well that did.
And so Taika wanted this new Thor to be more of a 1970s, 80s science fiction fantasy. I know he looked to Big Trouble in Little China as an inspiration for Thor Ragnarok.
Yeah, well, you know, this whole thing actually kind of started with Chris Hemsworth. He had gotten tired of playing Thor, almost, because he'd been playing this character for 5 films at this point, I think.
Yeah, this is his 5th appearance.
Okay, so 4 times previously. And he felt that it was a little stale. He felt that he was doing pretty much the same thing every time, and as an actor, you know, you want to switch it up. And so he went to Kevin Feige, and he was like, look, man, we got to do something different. We need to cut his hair. He wanted the hair gone because he didn't want the makeup. He wanted a different tone, and Marvel was on board. Kevin Feige said, okay, yeah, let's go in a different direction. And so that was their goal, setting out to make this film. And that's why Taika was ultimately hired, because he had a different direction for those. And in fact, Marvel actually brought in a whole bunch of different directors and presented them with like 10 different ideas for what this movie could be. And they said, here, take it, think about it, come back and give us a pitch, right? And so a lot of them did. Some of these people are like Ruben Fleischer, who did Zombieland and Gangster Squad, and the upcoming Venom film.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Rob Letterman, who did Shark Tale, Monsters vs. Aliens, Goosebumps,
no.
Detective Pikachu. That's an odd choice.
Yes.
And also Ross and Marshall Thurber, who we've talked about before, that did Dodgeball and Were the Millers. So all these people are more comedic directors, kind of following that trend that they did with Guardians. And Taika came in, and he actually put together a sizzle reel from some other films, and Marvel usually really hates this, but his was so good that they decided to give it to him.
And then here we have a movie with Taika Waititi at the helm. Now, Caleb, it's interesting you mentioned that Chris Hemsworth went to Kevin Feige and talked about his character arc, because another person who did that was Mark Ruffalo, who came to Kevin Feige and said, hey, so what's it going to look like for my character? And they talked about it, and apparently they both decided that, yeah, another solo Hulk film just can't happen. It's basically out of the works. So instead, they decided to pick a story arc for Bruce Banner and weave that into 3 movies. The first of this being Thor Ragnarok. The second, I'm assuming, is Infinity War, which means the third is still kind of up in the air.
Actually, the second is definitely Infinity War, and the third is the next Avengers film, Avengers 4, that comes out next year.
Oh, okay.
And it's not that they didn't want to do a solo Hulk movie, it's because of the rights. Universal Pictures actually owns the distribution rights to that franchise because of that early 2000s film. And so Disney/Marvel doesn't want to put one out because Universal apparently isn't really wanting to collaborate with them. I know Mark Ruffalo has said a few times that they just don't want to make money, and so they're not collaborating.
Yeah. Sony's smart on that end, but I guess not Universal.
Yeah, who knows at this point. But yeah, so he's here, and this kind of continues our buddy team-up kind of movies that we've been getting with the past few films, with Civil War and then Spider-Man.
It does, and talking about the Hulk, they not only integrate a great Thor story arc, but they integrate a huge story arc in the comics with Hulk called Planet Hulk.
That's right. We talked about this a little bit at the end of Age of Ultron, how when he was going up in the Quinjet, originally he was supposed to go in space, then the rumor came out that they were doing Planet Hulk, and they weren't actually going to do it at that point, so they decided to not put him in space. And then ultimately, they do Planet Hulk.
They do, yeah. So this was a huge crossover event, Caleb. I know you've read some of the comics. I've read some of the comics. It happened in Hulk Volume 2, and it started issue 92. So that was like back in 2006. And why don't you explain who the Illuminati are?
So the Illuminati are a group in the comics of these really, really smart people. Heroes, pretty much. So it's got like Doctor Strange, Mr. Fantastic. I think Black Panther's on the team. There's like 6 or 7 of them.
Close. So you have Tony Stark, Reed Richards, Black Bolt, Namor, Doctor Strange, and Charles Xavier, who, during the meeting to send the Hulk into outer space, he was actually absent during that.
Black Panther's not on it?
He is not, no. You got Black Bolt, though.
Okay. I thought he was. I don't know. But basically, they decided that the Hulk was too much of a danger to the Earth because he'd been rampaging, and they sent him off into space.
Yeah, so in this storyline, he was supposed to go to a planet that was uninhabited and basically live on it. His plane malfunctions, kind of like what we see in the movie, and he ends up falling to Sakaar, and we have the leader of Sakaar, the Red King, who drafts him and has him fight as a gladiator. And then much like Korg does in this movie, Hulk actually starts a successful rebellion, and he gathers a team of people called the Warbound who take over the planet, and then after he conquers the planet, the jet that he came in explodes and kills like millions of people. There's like an atomic explosion on this jet, and it kills millions of people, including his new wife. And so he gathers the Warbound, blames basically the Avengers for causing that to happen, the Illuminati, and then he goes back to Earth in another huge story arc called World War Hulk, where he hunts down each of the Illuminati to basically make them pay.
Yeah, it's a really, really big storyline in the comics, a seminal part of the Hulk's history. In fact, they actually made an animated version of that arc, I don't know, 8 years ago or so. Have you seen that?
I have not, but I've seen clips of it. It looks pretty good.
Yeah, it's really good. It differs from the comics a bit because that's a really big storyline, but it's good. It's a good entry point if you want to see what the story's about.
So not only do we get a tie-in from the Hulk with Planet Hulk, but we also get Thor's kind of storyline in Ragnarok, which is both big in the comics as well as Norse mythology. Sorry, Norse. I just said North.
Well, in the South mythology.
Yeah, which is different from the East.
Yeah, so Ragnarok, the end of worlds, the end of Asgard. This is something that's been around in Norse mythology, like you said, for a long time. I mean, as long as Norse mythology has been around.
Pretty much.
Yeah, there's not people just adding stuff to the mythology.
No.
But this is like their version of the apocalypse.
It really is. It's a series of future events where a great battle happens and a number of the gods die. So like Odin, Tyr, Heimdall, Loki, and a bunch of others, Thor, all die in this mythology. And the meaning of Ragnarok, I mean, there's several meanings, but it's basically comes down to either the fate of the gods or the twilight of the gods. And in Norse mythology, basically Loki unchains Fenrir, which is his son, a giant wolf. It's mythology, whatever. And then with the gods, they attack Asgard, but they meet on a battle of the plains of Vigrid, I believe. And then Surtur, or Surt, as he's called in Norse mythology, which is the same, fire giant that we see in this movie, sets fire to Asgard and the Bifrost, and then all these gods kill each other. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but we're talking about the movie here, not mythology.
Yeah, the mythology is really deep, but they do an interesting job bringing that into this film.
They do. They tie a little bit of the comics in here. Did you read any of the Thor Ragnarok comics?
I'm going to be honest, I have never read a Thor comic.
Okay. Thanks for your honesty, Caleb. Well, in the comics, it's really hard to find a title Thor Ragnarok because it's technically under what's called Avengers Disassembled, which was another huge story arc kind of before Planet Hulk that took place in August 2004 to January 2005, and the Avengers issue 503. So like in that storyline in Thor Volume 2, there was something called Thor Ragnarok. So basically, the Avengers disassembled, they broke up the Avengers team, a lot of heroes died, and then they wanted to do the same with Thor, so why not bring in Ragnarok? So what's interesting about this comic is that what happens in the comic, a lot of that happens in this movie. For example, Thor's hammer is destroyed. Loki, for a time being, takes over Asgard. Odin dies, and Thor gouges out both of his eyes. You have Fenrir and most of the other gods you see in this movie. And then something that's kind of different from the movie is that Thor makes a bet with Surtur to reforge his hammer, and he leads him to Asgard, and then Surtur destroys Asgard, which is, kind of similar, but basically that Thor storyline ends Volume 2 of Thor, and they wait a couple years to reboot it again in Volume 3 in 2007.
Yeah, and that Fenrir is actually called Fenris in the Marvel version of Norse mythology, and that's the giant wolf that we see in this film.
That's right. And then another interesting tidbit is back in Civil War, that robot we talked about that in the comics Reed Richards makes, the Thor robot, he is called Ragnarok in the comics.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yep. So Caleb, for the marketing of this movie, it heavily leaned on one song, the Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin. I don't know if you know the lyrics, but they're pretty fitting. It's, "We come from the land of the ice and snow, from the midnight sun where the hot springs flow. The hammer of the gods will drive our ships to new lands to fight the horde and sing and cry, Valhalla, I am coming."
I didn't know the lyrics. So is that song actually inspired by Norse mythology?
It is, and it's actually interesting to note that Waititi used this song during his pitch to Marvel, and it's one of the ways that he won over all the Marvel executives to have him direct.
Yeah, that's true. The marketing for this film, I feel, really, really was trying to prepare you for such a different take on Thor. I remember when they announced it, they had a logo that said Thor Ragnarok, and it was kind of in the style of Thor the Dark World's logo. But then they released a new one that was much, much different. It was in the style, it's a logo we end up getting, but it's like this 70s, 80s kind of weird retro look, and I was not really on board. I was like, this is way too much of a left turn. I kind of thought it was a joke at first.
Sure, so you thought it was basically taking point from Guardians of the Galaxy?
I didn't think that. A lot of people did. And that's actually a very common misconception, is this movie was not trying to be Guardians. I know that there's a heavy influence with music, like we're talking about now, a lot of color, a lot of humor, but that's not Marvel trying to imitate Guardians. That's Taika Waititi just doing his thing.
But you're right, marketing, they tried to set you up so you know what was happening. For example, did you see any of the quick shorts of Team Thor Part 1 or 2 that Waititi directed, where Thor is basically living on Earth?
Yeah, that's really, really funny.
Yeah, they're great. But the marketing, I thought, was interesting because they also had two huge reveals. They basically showed that Thor's hammer breaks and that Hulk is in the movie, which are kind of two big ones to reveal.
Yeah, but I think for Hulk, it's a hook, right? Oh, hey guys, look, it's not just a Thor movie. Our past Thor movies didn't do super well, so we're going to bring in a character that people really do like, Hulk. And so that's going to draw people in. And then the hammer thing is a dramatic twist. It's like, oh, what is he going to do without his hammer? So I think that's a very smart thing to advertise, instead of advertising other things like, oh, look, Asgard is actually being destroyed or something like that.
Yeah, so it's following in the footsteps of Spider-Man with Tony Stark and Spider-Man. They're going to show the Hulk. Yeah, I would agree with that. And this is the first year that Marvel has actually released 3 films instead of their usual 2.
Yeah, step up for Marvel. They've got so many properties going at this point that they decided it was time to go ahead and bump it up to 3, which I think is good. They like to spread them out. This year that we're in, 2018, I feel like they're a bit more condensed than they should be, because we had Black Panther in February, we're going to have Infinity War in April, and then we're going to have Ant-Man and the Wasp in July. I kind of liked how it was last year, where we got maybe 2 in the summer and then 1 like in November or something.
Yeah, I like how they were spread out versus all kind of being blocked together right up front.
I think it's a better model for preventing people from getting burnt out.
Exactly. And so in Thor Ragnarok, also known in Japan as Thor Battle Royale, no relation to Fortnite, we have some new casting. We have Cate Blanchett playing Hela. We have Jeff Goldblum as the Grand Master, Tessa Thompson as Valkyrie, Karl Urban as Scourge, and finally, Taika Waititi, the director himself, as Korg.
So, I know that you know who Jeff Goldblum is. Are you familiar with any of these other people?
Karl Urban, for sure. How could you not know Eeyore from The Lord of the Rings, as well as Bones from Star Trek?
He shows up in everything. I mean, he was Judge Dredd. He's one of those actors that just can transform himself and make himself look completely different. I've seen him in several movies, and I think he's really good.
Yeah, he really is. I love him as an actor. I'm not super familiar with Cate Blanchett, but I do know that Charlize Theron was actually considered for this role as well.
Oh, I could definitely see that. I think Cate is probably a better choice. She's a much more seasoned actress. I don't know her movies specifically, but I've seen her in things. And she feels more like a traditional actress, kind of like Anthony Hopkins, more classically trained. I don't know if that's true, but I think that getting someone like that and bringing them into this film really, really elevates it.
And she basically took on this role to please her children, because they're huge Marvel fans, and they were like, Mom, you have to do this. And so she did.
Now, we do get the introduction of Jeff Goldblum as the Grandmaster, and man, what a legend this guy is.
Independence Day, Jurassic Park, The Fly, just to name a few.
Yeah, it was a really big reveal for him to be here, and I think he's great. He is really super wacky and really super Jeff Goldblum, but that's not a bad thing.
No, he is definitely Goldblumish in this film, if you can say that, and it works. It fits the tone of this movie. All right, Caleb, with that foundation built, why don't we dive into this movie?
Thor's world is about to explode. His devious brother, Loki, has taken over Asgard. The powerful Hela has emerged to steal the throne for herself, and Thor is imprisoned on the other side of the universe. To escape captivity and save his home from imminent destruction, Thor must first win a deadly alien contest by defeating his former ally and fellow Avenger, the Incredible Hulk. But without his hammer Mjolnir, how can Thor prevent the total annihilation that is Ragnarok?
So this movie opens up in Muspelheim, which in Norse mythology is one of the 9 worlds ruled by Surtur, or in the Marvel comics, Surtur. Basically, you just add a U in somewhere. And his fire demons, which appeared in the comics in Thor issue 129 in 1966.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting location. I think the way they visualize it, we open here with Thor kind of in the cage, and we get a little hint that this is going to be a funnier movie. We get a slightly different take on Thor, but the location I think is stunning.
Location is amazing, and I think this sets the humor of the movie right away compared to the other Thor movies. I mean, you have Thor here talking to a pile of bones. He's kind of talking to the audience as well. And then when he's talking to Surtur himself, he keeps spinning, so it keeps stopping. And I think it sets the tone of this movie up really well. I mean, what TD said, that 80% of the movie is ad-libbed.
Oh, I could totally see that. And Chris Hemsworth is a very comedic person. He hasn't really showed it very much in the MCU films, but in the other films he's been in, he's funny, he's got great comic timing, and so I think to utilize those skills is a great thing.
So this picks up 2 years after the Age of Ultron movie that we saw. So Thor has taken off, and he has been searching for Infinity Stones and receiving dreams of Ragnarok as well.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we saw in Age of Ultron when he had that vision from Scarlet Witch. I'm assuming it's just the same things playing over and over again.
And so he hasn't been able to find any of the Infinity Stones, but he has found Surtur, who, as stated in Norse mythology and in the comics, causes Ragnarok. So he is here to basically take that chance away.
Yes, it's said that his quest for the Infinity Stones led him here. It doesn't say specifically how or why, but he is here. And, you know, Surtur is a really big person in the comics, a really big villain. And people have been begging for him for a long time, and seeing him here, I think he looks really, really good. I think the design they went with and the visual style that they chose to use for him is perfect, and I think that they still probably could have done Dormammu and made him look different than this guy. We talked about that in our Doctor Strange episode. But even though they decided not to, I like the design.
Yeah, his design is amazing. Taika Waititi actually did the motion capture for Surtur. And Caleb, you mentioned he is in the comics. He appeared just 14 issues after the first Thor in the Journey into Mystery issue 97 in 1963.
Now, they do mention here that the crown is the source of his powers. I don't think that's the case in the comics, right?
Yeah, I don't think that's accurate in the comics, but it works here in the movie, I guess.
Yeah, it's used as a plot device. I mean, I wish he was around for more than just being this plot device, but I guess if that's all we can get, I'll take it. But this quickly falls into a battle as we get an Avengers callback where Thor is waiting for his hammer to come back, kind of like when he's about to fight Hulk in the Avengers film and he's waiting for the hammer. And it goes into this crazy battle. And Zach, I think that this is the best Thor fight scene we have ever gotten. And I think even by the end of this film, it is the best Thor fight scene we will get.
I would definitely say it's one of the best Thor fight scenes. It's very comic-ish. While watching this, I can totally imagine the pages and panels of a comic book showing this movie. It was great. I loved how we got to see the perspective of the hammer, which I thought kind of tied the emotion of the viewer into the hammer, which will be more impactful when we lose it, as well as the fact that we get the Immigrant song playing here for the first time, which is important because I'll mention that later on at the ending of this movie.
Yeah, and I think that the things they decided to do here are very creative in terms of action. I love the dragon. I mean, that fantasy element, bringing the dragon in here, I think it's really fun and really entertaining. I wish that we would have gotten maybe a little bit more of this. I like the film we did get. But here at the beginning, except for when he's in the cage, he is actually pretty much old Thor. He's not super jokey. That comes in a bit later in the film. The cage, I think, was just, like you said, a way to tell us that's what it's going to be later. But for the first half of this movie, or well, maybe not half, the first 30 minutes of this movie, he's not jokey. He is the Thor that we know.
You know, Caleb, I would actually disagree with you. I thought in the cage it sets him up as a very different Thor. He was joking with Surtur, and him spinning on the chain, he was joking. And then we get some of that pretty early on as well with Doctor Strange and some of these other characters he interacts with. So I would say from the get-go, he's a little different. Maybe not as different as the movie progresses, but that's his character arc. And so after the battle, we get this opening title with fire singed into the ground. And while this is going on, up in Asgard, Heimdall is gone, and instead we get Scourge.
That's right. And behold, his stack of stuff.
Exactly. Now, Scourge is in the comics. He is Scourge, the Executioner, who was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in Journey into Mystery, issue 103 in 1964.
We do get a reference here where he's holding up guns and he's like, these are my favorite. That's because Scourge in the comics is a really big fan of guns.
He is, and he actually does have guns in the comics later on, because, I mean, he has a pretty rich history. Like, he joined the Masters of Evil, the Mandarin, he fought the Hulk, but it's specifically in Thor issue 360 through 362 this is directly pulled from the movie. Because basically, Hela sways him to join the team and fight for the undead, but then he decides to help Thor by knocking Thor out and basically holding this bridge. It's a different bridge in the comics, but it's, basically the same premise, with a pair of M16s, and he kills a bunch of the undead, and then he dies, and he goes to Valhalla, which is the same kind of story arc we get here in the comics.
Yeah, and he's here because he says Heimdall has been branded a traitor. He's abandoned his post, and so they found someone to replace him. I kind of assumed that whoever took this role had the same power as Heimdall, where you could see everything. We find out that's not the case. That's only Heimdall in this movie.
Yeah, that's correct. Only Heimdall the god has that power. And so Thor comes back, and he quickly makes his way to find Odin, as Surtur has told him that Odin is not sitting in Asgard. And it's here, Caleb, that we get a scene within a scene, as we have a few actors portraying what happened in Thor the Dark World with Loki's sacrifice.
Yeah, so we get Chris's brother Luke Hemsworth here, probably best known for Westworld, as Thor. And we also get Matt Damon here playing Loki, which is out of left field and completely funny. And also Sam Neill as Odin.
That's right. So a bunch of little tidbits, little Easter eggs. I thought it was kind of funny as well. We also get a quick view of an actress playing Lady Sif, but this isn't the actual Lady Sif in the movie. She is gone during this movie. So she is usually played by Jamie Alexander, but she was shooting a TV show, Blind Spot. And so Kevin Feige basically said they could ignore her in this movie and just pretend she is off on a mission.
Which I think is actually a really good thing for her, because she would have died if she came here, and because she didn't come back, her character is still alive, so she can still return to the MCU in the future. We also get a throwaway line here where it's mentioned that Loki once turned Thor into a frog, which is funny, because that's a character in the comics. Not just a character, actually, Thor has been turned into a frog, but then there is a separate Frog Thor character.
That's correct. Throg, Frog of Thunder. I'm not making that up.
Yep, he hangs out with Peter Porker. Also not making that up. It's
no.
Spider-Ham. He's a pig.
That's right. Yeah, Thor was turned into the frog in 1986 for like 4 issues, and he has a hammer and a cape and everything. And then he actually recently came back in a limited issue series called Pet Avengers with like Lockjaw and some other pets. And you have Throg, the Thunder Frog.
But it is pretty much quickly revealed here that Loki has been impersonating Odin. Exactly. I like that they deal with this quickly if this isn't going to be the focus of the film, but I'm disappointed that they spent all that time in Thor 2 to set this up, only to do nothing with it.
Yeah, I remember you griping about that in our Thor the Dark World podcast, Caleb. I'm completely fine with it. I mean, how they reveal Loki is from the comics. Thor issue 359, Thor does the exact same thing to Loki. If it's not going to be a plot device in the movie, might as well get rid of it so we can move on to the actual plot.
Before he is actually revealed, though, as Odin, Loki has a line where he's like, Thor says, well, while there's chaos out in there in the 9 realms, you're just sitting here eating grapes and watching a play. And he says, I've been busy with Security Council meetings, which is a funny callback to the Avengers, the World Security Council.
And when he finally does reveal himself, Loki has a new costume. We see a lot more green in this costume. I think it's more prominent than any of the other movies. His hair is also a little bit longer and greasier than some of the other movies as well.
I don't feel that this is any more green than the previous ones, but it's nice to see that they are still continuing that green motif that they've started really in the comics and carried through to the movies. But now that Thor knows that this is not Odin, he's questioning Loki where Odin is, and he forces him to take him to Odin. And so they travel to Earth, where Loki has banished Odin, into a retirement home that is no longer there.
That's right. So Shady Acres, which you might know that name from either South Park or Ace Ventura, which both have Shady Acres retirement home. And it's here we actually get an Easter egg because Thor is dressed in civilian clothing with an umbrella, which is in the comics what Donald Blake would use, and he would smash that umbrella on the ground to turn into Thor and have the umbrella turn into his hammer, which Thor later does in this movie. And not only that, but Caleb, I think there's kind of an apparent issue here. We had somebody on Twitter point this out, that how come two civilians are able to recognize Thor in civilian clothing, but not Loki? Because Loki tried to destroy New York, so he's pretty prominent, but nobody recognized him.
Well, I think we mentioned this in a previous episode. Thor is famous at this point. He's been with the Avengers for a few different years. He's been on Earth protecting people. People know who the Avengers are. Their faces are plastered everywhere. Loki, on the other hand, was only on Earth during the invasion, and the only time you would have seen him was when he was invading New York. But he was on these flying ships, he wasn't anywhere close to people, so people would not have been able to see him. The only way his picture could have gotten out is if there was some kind of security imaging of him. But again, if he's on these big ships flying every which direction and on top of skyscrapers, I don't know how those images would have been taken.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, we do get a throwaway line here that Jane Foster has broken up with Thor, or Thor's broken up with her, basically throwing Natalie Portman out with the bathwater. And Loki disappears with a card reading 177A Bleecker Street.
And so we get our cameo that was promised to us at the end of Doctor Strange, as Thor goes to that address and finds it is Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum. And basically, Doctor Strange is concerned that Loki is here because he poses a threat to the Earth. And we get some funny scenes here. I really like the magic that Doctor Strange uses here. It feels a lot more like what I wanted to see from his movie, where he's very proficient. But he also has a slight costume change.
That's right. So we get gloves. He is wearing the Eye of Agamotto, even though he returned that in the Doctor Strange movie. And basically, he looks kind of like he does in the comics. And his inclusion here is kind of a surprise, because I've talked to several people. I watched this with my friend. I know my dad and a couple others were very surprised that Doctor Strange was included in this movie. Even though he shows up with Thor at the end of Doctor Strange, I think that's so far apart that if you weren't paying attention to any of the promotional materials on like comic book sites, this would be a surprise.
Yeah, it's a really nice surprise. I think it fits well, it flows well, it's not intrusive to the film. I think that this is how you do a cameo in these types of movies. I will say that the gloves don't really make sense, because we will see, or well, we have seen in the trailers for Infinity War, he's not wearing those gloves anymore. So it's just kind of, I guess, a one-time thing for this film. But nonetheless, it's nice to see it.
And this also ties into the Avengers Infinity War Prelude, the second issue in the comic, where it shows that Wong and Doctor Strange are talking about the Infinity Stones. Wong's basically telling him about all the Infinity Stones, and then alerts him that Loki is on Earth, which is how Doctor Strange knows that Loki is on Earth. And so he brings Thor in, and then after Thor's gone, we see that Wong comes back into the room and basically tells Doctor Strange about the Soul Gem. It doesn't reveal where it is, but basically the danger is incoming.
And so Doctor Strange agrees to help Thor if Loki will leave Earth. And so he tells him that Odin is in Norway, and he just teleports him there instantly.
That's right. So after the wizards on Earth and naming himself the master of mystic arts, we are transported to Norway, which is a change in location from the original shooting of this movie.
Yeah, so this scene was originally supposed to be in New York. It was actually in the trailers. You could see Hela appears in like an alleyway. And Taika decided that they wanted to change this because he felt that the New York area was not reverent enough to the scene. He felt like it was too distracting, and he wanted it to be more peaceful, more of a big deal. And so they chose Norway because I'm assuming that's where Norse mythology came from. And so it's kind of poetic in that way.
It is, and not only did Waititi want to change it, but apparently test screens didn't go over very well. People felt extremely sorry for Odin, and he didn't get the right feeling he wanted to in that scene. And thus, we got Norway. Now, Anthony Hopkins originally actually didn't want to return for Thor 3 until he read the script, and I'm assuming after he read the script, he was okay with it, because he's like, oh, I'm going to die, so I don't care. I'll come back in the movie.
Yeah, he's not in this very long. He was probably only on set for a week or two.
Now, Caleb, I don't know about you, but here in the movie, I thought it was kind of poor CGI, which for me, unfortunately, took away from the death.
I wholeheartedly agree, with one caveat. So I remember this looking really, really bad in the theaters. Watching it on my Blu-ray, I didn't feel it looked as bad. I don't know if they improved it. I know sometimes they do improve special effects between the theater and the Blu-ray release. Or maybe it's just because I'm not watching it on, a 75-foot screen. It still doesn't look perfect, but it looks better.
Okay, see, I would disagree with you. I was particularly paying close attention to that when watching it on the Blu-ray. I thought it still looked just as bad as it does in the movie, which was kind of disappointing, as I thought I had wished that they would have touched that up a little bit.
Yeah, it would have been better if they could have actually gone to that location.
But we do get some unanswered questions. For example, why is Odin in Norway? Why does Odin die? And why and how did he trap Hela?
Yeah, these things aren't really going to be explained. There's some of those are kind of throwaway lines they mention, like why she's imprisoned. But this is all glossed over for plot.
And Odin quickly here does die. And we actually hear some of the same score that we heard when Frigga died in Thor the Dark World. And Odin is kind of whisked away, as you said, Caleb, with some unanswered questions, which is okay because this movie is quickly fast-paced and we move on to the next event.
Which I think is a detriment to this film because there's no time to grieve for Odin. We show up, he's dying, we don't know why he's dying, and he just does. It's like he gives up. And so immediately this portal opens and Hela jumps through, and Thor and Loki do not have time to grieve the death of their father.
No, they don't, because we're reintroduced to our enemy of this movie, Hela, the first female villain in the MCU.
And also Thor and Loki's sister. And this kind of ties into some things in the comics, because in the comics, Thor and Loki both have more siblings. There's some other people like Tyr, and I think Balder is one of their brothers. In the movie version, it's only these three, though. Yeah, it really is. I mean, in Norse mythology, Hela is the queen of Hell and the daughter of Loki. In the comics, she appears just an issue after Scourge in Journey into Mystery 102. And allegedly, she is the daughter of Loki, but I don't think that's ever confirmed. But basically, in the comics, she's evil. She has a ton of storylines. And her most recent one was an Unworthy Thor, which was a quick 5-issue series in 2006, 2007, where Hela basically promised Thanos death and killed a bunch of his Black Order and a bunch of other stuff. But, I mean, she's extremely powerful in the comics like she is in the movie here. So Thor attacks her with Mjolnir, and she grabs it and pretty much instantly destroys it. I know this was kind of shocking development. Obviously, it was in the trailer, so we knew it was going to happen. But what do you think of this, Zach?
Yeah, it was shocking, and I think it helped to develop Thor's character.
I do have a question here, though, Zach. There's a lot of emphasis put on the fact that Hela is the goddess of death in this movie. And I'm just wondering, what does that actually mean in the MCU? Thor's the god of thunder, Loki's the god of mischief, Hela is the goddess of death, and I kind of assumed that these were just titles given to them, but the way that it's played out in this film is like, that is her. There can be no other person that is the goddess of death. And I'm just wondering if you have any theories on what that actually means, because it doesn't hold a lot of sway here, I don't feel like.
I mean, I think it fits with Norse mythology as well as the comics. She's the goddess of death. She is probably the queen of hell. If you watch in the movie, she is stabbed through the chest, and she doesn't die. So I think it's maybe more of a call out to their powers. Loki is the god of mischief, so those are kind of his powers. Thor's the god of thunder, so those are his powers. Hela's the goddess of death, so she is able to use the internal flame to bring back the dead. She is also pretty much indestructible.
Okay, so pretty much what I thought initially then. But we are quickly whisked away in the Bifrost. Thor and all of them try to go back to Asgard, and while we're here, Hela pushes them out.
Yeah, this is actually the first time we actually see Bifrost travel in its full, because we have this mini fight scene as they're being teleported back. And as you said, Caleb, they're pushed out, and Hela returns to Asgard, where we see Volstagg and Findrel die in 2 seconds, which was kind of unfortunate.
Yeah, that is really sad. Apparently they were on set for a day, and they both recorded little mini dialogues or things to say when she walked in, and they cut all those, and they don't really get to say anything. She just immediately kills them, which is really a shame. Even though they're cleaning house, I would have liked to see them in the future. But also, since she's here, she doesn't really want to kill Scourge. She sees something in him that she might be able to use, and so she hires him.
That's right. And so while that's happening, we get this awesome scene where we travel through planets and cosmos, something that I wish we had seen in Guardians of the Galaxy, where we arrive on Sakaar, finally. And Caleb, the design of this planet is amazing. The colors, the city landscape, the idea that it's a trash planet, It's what I wish Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 was, but here it is amazing.
Yeah, and this differs from the comic book version. Sakaar is the name of the planet that Planet Hulk takes place on. It's more of a desert-style planet. There's not much there. It's kind of barren. So it is a change of kind of scenery to put it here, but I do like it. And a lot of this is actually very inspired by Jack Kirby, who was one of the original Marvel artists, and the kind of artistry and alien-type designs that he would put into the Thor comic books.
And here we get a different race of Sakaarians than we have seen in the MCU.
So in Guardians of the Galaxy, those bug-type creatures, the ones that were kind of burnt-looking, the ones that Yondu killed a whole bunch of at the end of the first movie, those are Sakaarans. But here, these people look different. And Zach, the reason that is because the Sakaarans that are in Guardians of the Galaxy are the native species to this planet. The ones we see here are people that have come through these wormholes, that have been dropped off, that have kind of made this place their home, but they're not natives.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, actually. And at this point, it has only been 26 minutes into the movie. So we are whisked around. There's a lot that happens. And finally, we get kind of to the main chunk where we spend a lot of time on Sakaar. We see that Thor feels kind of weak without his hammer. He doesn't really know what to do. And Valkyrie appears to save him from the Sakaarians who are trying to basically kill him. And Valkyrie is somebody we do see in the comics, who appears in The Defenders issue 4 by Roy Thomas and John Buscemi as Brundlehild. But she actually later appears as Valkyrie in the same storyline we get kind of here in the comics in issue 142 of The Incredible Hulk, which is why she is called Scrapper 142. And in the comics, she's a love interest of Thor. She's very different. She's blonde and tall and has different armor. And she's like a founding member of the Secret Avengers as well as part of the Defenders. But we kind of get this Valkyrie in a flashback in the movie.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with them changing her character. I'm just not sure if this character actually needs to be in this film. We'll talk about it more as the film goes along. But she feels more like a plot device than something that needs to be here. But she does end up saving him, and they go to the Grandmaster's Tower, where we get a couple other Easter eggs.
That's right. If you look on the Grandmaster's Tower, he has engraved his champions on the tower. Here we see 3 particular people, Beta Ray Bill, Ares, which is the Greek god of war, and another individual, the Bi-Beast, which is the one with 2 heads. All of these appear in the comics. All of these are pretty major characters. We've talked about Beta Ray Bill before. He's kind of an alternate Thor in the comics. Ares is the Greek god of war. You might know him from Wonder Woman. He also appears in Marvel Comics, and particularly his probably biggest storyline is in the Dark Avengers. And finally, Bi-Beast, which is like a gigantic 2-headed villain of the Hulk.
And the Beta Ray Bill actually kind of ties into the Planet Hulk storyline. I believe in the comics, in the Colosseum, Hulk ends up fighting the Silver Surfer. In the movie version, that was changed. It's Beta Ray Bill that the Hulk fights. And so this kind of ties into him being a champion for the Grandmaster.
So as Thor is getting carried away by Valkyrie, we do see a brief glimpse of what's happening in Asgard. And here we basically get shown Hela's power. She takes out Hogun and his warriors, and she is amazing. It's brutal. It reminds me kind of Sauron and Lord of the Rings. She gets stabbed. She can't die. She's killing everybody really quickly. The CGI is okay. I thought it was kind of off in some parts, Caleb, but for the most part, it shows her power level. Hogun dies, which I thought is how the other Warriors 3 should have died, but at least he gets a good death.
Yeah, and her powers are very similar to Loki's in terms of these knives things. Loki kind of likes to make knives appear out of nowhere. She does the same thing. There's also another reference to Loki and Zod from Superman, when she asked them to kneel before her. Of course, Loki really wanted that in Avengers when he yelled kneel, and Zod famously says kneel before Zod in Superman 2.
Jumping back to Sakaar, Thor goes through a very interesting tunnel where the Willy Wonka theme is playing, and we hear that all lost and unloved things are now the Grandmasters, like Thor.
Yeah, this is kind of something that is very similar to like a Disney World ride that you go through when you get kind of this voiceovers coming over you. It's really funny. It's very strange, but it ultimately ends up with Thor coming out of this into, I guess, I don't know if it's the throne room, but this room that the Grandmaster is in.
Yeah, and we are introduced to Jeff Goldblum as the Grandmaster, who does appear in the comics, Avengers issue 69 in 1969. And Caleb, we've talked about him in the MCU, how he is the brother of the Collector. That's the same in the comics. He's the brother of the Collector. Just like the Collector, he is also one of the oldest beings in the universe. And he has a throwaway line here in the movie where he says he puts on a contest of champions. That's probably his biggest story arc in the comics, which is a comic titled Contest of Champions, where he makes a deal with Death to bring back his brother, and to do so, they select teams from Earth. So you have a bunch of, the Avengers, X-Men, Fantastic Four, and other superhero teams fighting in a comic book issue Contest of Champions.
Yeah, and that title is actually mentioned a few times throughout the film. I think it's also mentioned during the Willy Wonka music kind of intro thing. But this is a pretty big thing in the comics. They had Contest of Champions 1, and then they did a sequel series called Contest of Champions 2. I have read the sequel. It's fine. It's decent. It's just comic book fun. There's also a mobile video game on iOS and I think Android called Contest of Champions, which is a fighting game.
We also see his sidekick here, who is named Topaz. I believe she is in the comics, Caleb, but from a comic called Werewolf by Night, issue 13, she's kind of like a sorceress, but she looks exactly the same as the Topaz here in the movie. So I believe that's where they pulled her from, but I don't think it really necessarily matters.
I didn't do a lot of research into her. I did just a tiny bit, but from what I saw, she's from the Ultraverse, which is another universe that Marvel acquired at one point. And so she's a pretty different character, though.
Now, there's also a deleted scene here, which kind of explains more about the disc that's on Thor's neck. These are called obedience discs, which is what the Grandmaster named them. And in kind of a funny scene, it just elaborates more on how eccentric the Grandmaster is, as kind of these bat creatures fly into the room. You see the guards trying to take them out. There's furry creatures making out in the background. And it's this weird, eclectic, funny scene that happens. I see why they cut it, because it has nothing really to do with the storyline. But I wish they would have kept it in, because I do love seeing the scenes with Thor interacting with the Grandmaster.
And it's also in this room that we get some of those Jack Kirby designs drawn directly from the comics. There's these creatures in the background that look kind of like the Celestial we saw from Guardians of the Galaxy. And they're fully clothed. You can't see their faces. And they are taken directly from specific panels that Jack Kirby drew.
And Caleb, you are pardoned. Pardoned from life. And it's here that the Grandmaster pardons his cousin by killing him. And in a deleted scene, we learn that his cousin was basically pardoned from life because of gambling, which I guess doesn't really make sense, which is why they cut it. But he is named Carlos here after Carlo Pagleon. I don't really know his last name, but he is one of the writers, inkers who wrote Planet Hulk.
We also learn here that time moves differently on Sakaar. It moves much more slowly. So while you're on Sakaar for a couple weeks, it's only been, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes outside of Sakaar.
Yeah, and a really great line/scene with Jeff Goldblum where he states, about the time, and then he is, moves his eyes a little bit and smiles a little bit, and it's just really awkward. But Caleb, it does kind of bring up an interesting point, because later on in the movie, we find that Bruce Banner has been the Hulk for 2 years since Age of Ultron. But if he has been trapped on Sakaar for those 2 years, he could have been the Incredible Hulk for like 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. We don't really know.
That's true, and it's actually Thor that says it's been 2 years since then, so from his perspective, it has been that long. But yeah, so we could, if we really wanted to break this down, we could say, well, it takes Thor X amount of time to get there, and Loki's been there for, I think they say 2 weeks, so it is a lot longer. So that's interesting, because the filmmakers actually said he's been Hulk for 2 or 3 years, but that doesn't make sense with the time thing you're talking about.
Exactly. So Thor is whisked off to the prison to fight in this gladiatorial ring, and we get introduced to 2 members of the Warbound from the comics. We get Korg and Meek. So Korg is very interesting because he does appear not in the Warbound comics, but way before that. Do you remember when I talked about back in our Thor podcast, Thor's backstory in the comics, like his original comic book title?
Yeah.
So Korg is one of those Cronin monsters that appears from, I believe, Saturn or Mars and lands on Earth in that really cheesy comic. So they kind of retconned that and said, yeah, one of those Cronin is actually Korg. And then on his way back on their kind of alien spaceship, he gets trapped at Sakaar. But other than that, he's pretty much like he is in the comics, just a lot more goofy and interesting.
Yeah, a lot more funny.
Yeah, we also get Meek, who in the comics, he's a humanoid roach, which is very different from in the movie where he's more of like a larva kind of creature. But I mean, they're both warbound. They're both great.
But back on Asgard, we get to see what's happening a little bit more here. And Hela has taken the Executioner up to the throne room, and we get some story about what actually happened in the past.
That's right, it covered up history, which I actually loved because this is something I could totally believe that would happen on Asgard, and that's happened in medieval history before.
Yeah, and this kind of ties into some things we said in Thor the Dark World about Odin's father covering things up and not talking about it. And this is kind of just to show us what's going on with her on Asgard. And I kind of feel like she's an afterthought in this film, which is a shame considering she's the main villain. But for most of the film, she doesn't have anything to do with Thor. She doesn't have much to do just in general. She's already killed all the Asgardians. And so these scenes don't feel very necessary.
I mean, I guess I could see that. She's just so powerful, and you have Thor on an alternate storyline that I think what they do with here is fine. Because after she does uncover the history, she goes down to Odin's treasure room, where we find out that gauntlet that everybody has been talking about in the MCU is simply fake.
Yes, the fake Infinity Gauntlet. It is the right hand to Thanos' left hand.
But it is still fake. It's not real whatsoever. But I do have to ask the question, why didn't Hela pick up the Tesseract? I'm assuming it's because she didn't know what it was, but she did say that looks interesting.
I don't think there's any reason for her to pick it up. Why does she need it?
I mean, she's incredibly powerful, but if she's trying to destroy the rest of the 9 worlds, it would help to have an Infinity Gem in your back pocket.
She doesn't want to destroy them, she wants to conquer them. And while the Tesseract could help, I don't think she needs it at all. She's already very proficient in conquering, and I think she really wants to live out the experience of conquering, and that's what she loves. She loves the bloodlust. So why kill people with a Tesseract with an energy beam when you can kill them with a knife in your hands? But I do have another question. She ends up taking the Eternal Flame, and she goes down into this crypt, I guess, beneath the vault. We actually find out the vault isn't just sitting in a vast thing of nothingness, which is what I kind of assumed from the first 2 films. There is a crypt at the very bottom of it with old Asgardian warriors, and she takes it and revives the dead with it. Later we'll see that the Eternal Flame also brings back Surtur. So I was wondering, can the Eternal Flame bring back anything? Is that its power? Is this a power that Hela has, or is it not really very clear?
I'm assuming it's a power Hela has. I mean, it's very much like a necromancy power from like D&D that we see that she has to bring back all these fighters, as well as I think the Eternal Flame is just specific to Surtur because he is fire to bring him back. So I would just say it's a power Hela has and specifically for Surtur as well. So we jump back to Sakaar where we have Thor and Loki talking, and Caleb, you said there's not a lot of time to mourn Odin. I think this is one of those times where Loki and Thor are talking about Odin, and Thor is mourning Odin, that allows the audience to slow down for 1 second and mourn him. Before we are quickly whisked away to this stadium fight, where Thor will become the new Doug.
That's right. Before we actually get into the stadium, we get this scene in, I don't know, like a locker room style place. We get a lot of comedy from Korg. Korg actually pulls out this spear. It's got like 3 points on it, and he mentions that it'd only be good for like 3 vampires huddled together. That's a reference to one of Taika's probably most popular films, What We Do in the Shadows, which is a vampire film. Apparently they use something like that. I haven't seen the film, but I want to.
We also get our Stan Lee cameo, who is the strange old man who cuts Thor's hair. And it kind of goes into, I guess, Thor's new costume that we see here. He has half of his cape ripped off, he has a new haircut, he gets a new helmet, and it's this change in costume that we actually do see some of in the comics.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's not exactly the same, but his comic book version has progressed over the years, And I can't recall what comic, but this is kind of a portrayal of kind of a mixture of some of his comics and what he looks like.
I think the biggest thing here for fans is the fact that Thor finally has his helmet.
He has the wings on his helmet, yep, which he is very well known for in the comics. And it is revealed here that who Thor is facing is the Incredible Hulk.
That's right, a reference to the name, the Incredible Hulk, in the comics. That's what his comic book is called.
And he has his costume that he has in Planet Hulk. He has the gladiator helmet with the red on top of it, as well as his hammer and axe, which he has in the comics, and as well as some plating and belting.
Yeah, and I think this costume looks really, really great. It's ripped straight from the comics, and it works really well. And, as much as I love this, Loki hates this. He has this really bad reaction to Hulk being here. He's like, get me out of here.
And this is the first time that we actually hear Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk instead of Lou Ferrigno, who's kind of voiced the Hulk, / they've used his old voices and auto-tuned some of them. But Hulk speaks, and this is the first time we kind of hear him speak.
Yeah, and he says, no Banner, only Hulk, telling us that Banner is not in control at all here. This is entirely Hulk.
And that is a response to Chris Hemsworth line, "This is a friend from work," which was actually a made-up line, and it was suggested to Chris from a Make-A-Wish child who paid a visit to the set that day and suggested that he say that, and he did, and it made it in the movie.
Yeah, some of the best stuff can come from children sometimes.
Oh, so true. Now, Caleb, when we go to the Grandmaster and Loki, who are sitting in the box seats watching this happen, is that somebody dressed as a Celestial standing behind the Grandmaster?
This goes back to those Jack Kirby designs I was talking about earlier. They just ripped these from some comics, so he's not supposed to be a Celestial, but Jack Kirby also designed all the Celestials, so that's why he looks like that.
Well, we do get some funny jokes here. We get Thor trying the sun is getting really low. The kind of joking off of the Age of Ultron with the Black Widow doing the same with the Hulk. It doesn't work at all here, and that joke is continued on throughout the movie. We also get a joke where the Hulk grabs Thor and smashes him like he does Loki in the Avengers, which Loki calls out, stating, "That's how it feels."
Yeah, really, really funny. But then we get this, I don't know, kind of odd scene where Thor has a vision of Odin, and all of a sudden he has lightning powers.
So we get the scene here and a little later. I'm assuming it's Odin kind of communicating to him through the dead and tapping into his actual powers, right? Because in the comics, Thor controls a lot of the weather. We really haven't seen any of this in the MCU. He just uses his hammer, and that's about it. Some lightning, but not a lot. So I love that they kind of introduce the lightning power here, and that carries on through the rest of the movie.
I've always felt that Thor feels very underpowered in the movies compared to the comics, and that all his power is sourced from his hammer, which is not the case in the comics. And so I like that they brought that in here. I just think that the way they did it is strange. Like, it's revealed he's always had these powers, and that Mjolnir was a way to channel them, which is not really what we get Mjolnirs for in the previous films. It's a strange way to introduce it. I'm really glad they did, again, but maybe find a better way to do it.
But with these new lightning powers, he stands a chance against the Hulk. So Caleb, who actually is the strongest Avenger? Would Thor been able to defeat the Hulk if he hadn't been zapped by the Grandmaster, or would the Hulk have won, or are they pretty even?
I personally think Thor would have won, because he was really going at it, and it looked like Hulk was going to lose until Grandmaster stepped in and activated the obedience disc. But in terms of just raw brute strength, Hulk is stronger.
You know, I think Thor is the stronger Avengers. He was basically beating Hulk in the Avengers movie. It was kind of up in the air, but here he definitely would have won if the Grandmaster hadn't zapped him, which he does. And so we quickly jump to Asgard while Thor is knocked out and see Heimdall.
That's right. Real quick before that, we actually get Scourge named as Executioner, just like he is in the comics. And then we do jump to Heimdall, and we see that he is pretty much leading people to a hidden base, while Hela has been taking over Asgard.
And back on Sakaar, Thor is now in the room with the Hulk, and they have some great interaction. Now, if you look at Hulk's design, this actually comes from Ultimate Wolverine vs. Hulk. This is one of the first kind of Wolverine Hulk comics I collected, and it's where Hulk has gone into seclusion up in the mountains of Tibet, and he wears these huge beads. He has kind of these shawls, towels wrapped around him, and a harem of girls. So it's kind of the same without the harem.
Yeah, I don't think that would play too well in a Marvel movie.
No.
But there is a deleted scene here, Zach. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, in this deleted scene, Hulk is sleeping, and we actually hear Bruce Banner's voice. We hear him call out, and then Hulk wakes up and starts punching himself. So it kind of brings forth this idea that Bruce Banner and the Hulk are still struggling inside, which I thought was great. I definitely wish they would have included it. They don't, and I get why, because in this new Hulk design, Hulk talks. So this is the first time he's able to interact with people, and he kind of has the temperament / intelligence of maybe like a 4-year-old.
Yeah, I'd say that's about right. And I like it. I mean, this is a much different Hulk than we've ever gotten before. It's nice to see an intelligent Hulk where he's not just smashing the whole time, because there is a wealth of comic stories where he's like that. And so I think this is a step in the right direction.
And so Thor convinces Hulk to get Valkyrie so that they can all escape. And Caleb, Valkyrie here kind of has a statement, which I think brings up maybe some issues. She states that just like Thor, Hela's power comes from Asgard, or Hela's power comes from Asgard, just like yours. So Thor's power comes from Asgard?
Yeah, I noticed that too. It doesn't make any sense, especially considering at the end of this movie, Asgard is destroyed, yet Thor seems to still have all of his power.
Yeah, exactly. Well, after unsuccessfully throwing a ball at the window and not breaking, Thor is able to get this device off his neck, and he finds his way through the streets to the Quinjet. Now, there is a deleted scene here where actually Hulk jumps down after Thor and chases Thor through the street, which is how he kind of ends up at the Quinjet. I don't think that's really needed, but it's kind of interesting to note.
And the whole reason he's trying to make it to the Quinjet to begin with is he's had a vision through Heimdall that tells him what he needs to do, what's going on Asgard, and how he needs to get out, which is to go through the largest portal that's outside on Sakaar.
So he does get to the Quinjet, and he is able to unlock it through the term point break, which we talked about back in our Avengers podcast, is what Tony Stark says to Thor, where he says, "You got a mean swing, point break."
Yeah, and then the Hulk shows up and starts wrecking the Quinjet because he doesn't want Thor to leave. He wants him to stay there to be his friend. And of course, we get that video from the end of Age of Ultron with Black Widow coming on and talking to Hulk, trying to get him to stop. And this ends up, I guess, awakening Banner. And Banner kind of fights back, and we get this really violent transformation back into Banner, where he starts transforming into Banner, and then he goes back to the Hulk, and then back to Banner, and it's this back and forth that ultimately Banner does win.
And he states a little bit later, it's kind of in this scene on Sakaar, that if he were to turn back into the Hulk, he doesn't think he would ever come back as Banner.
Yeah, because he had been Hulk for so long, and he had no control over it. He's afraid that if it happens again, he will no longer have control over it again, and that Hulk will just live his days out as Hulk.
Which is giving credence to the fact that if you watch the Infinity War trailers, many people believe that it is Bruce Banner in the Hulk Buster armor instead of Tony Stark, which I wholeheartedly believe.
We do jump back here after this, back to the Grandmaster's chambers, where he's talking to Loki and Valkyrie, and he tells them to go get Thor and Hulk. And Loki does something that I've never seen him do before. He reads Valkyrie's mind.
Yeah, this is kind of a new power that he hasn't shown.
I was trying to think back and see if this opened up any plot holes where in the past movies maybe he's needed a piece of information and he wasn't able to get it. I don't think it does, which is crazy because normally something like this would open up a big plot hole. But ultimately he does read her mind.
And we get this amazing flashback scene. It is here that we see the original Valkyrie from the comics, who kind of throws herself in front of the Valkyrie from the movie. She's the girl with the blonde hair. She's pretty tall. That is what she looks like in the comics. And anyway, she saves this Valkyrie, who is able to stay alive and then escape to Sakaar later on and refuse her calling as a Valkyrie.
And so Loki and Valkyrie do go off to try to find Thor and Hulk. Ultimately, Loki does not find them. Val finds them out in, I guess, this Hulk kind of parade, I guess, that's going on, celebration. And she joins up with them. And this is where I start having an issue with Valkyrie. She seems boring in this film. From here through where they're escaping the ship battle, it's like 10 or 15 minutes. She doesn't feel needed at all. She feels boring. She doesn't seem to add much to the film. And so I don't really like this. I don't know. I feel like they could have either written this differently or given her more to do in this area, because she just doesn't feel like she needs to be here.
That's an interesting take, Caleb. I completely disagree. I think she's fun. I think she adds to the Revengers, which is what they call themselves. And I think she's a needed character. She helps them escape. She helps them later on in the battle. And she feels like a very much needed character, way better than Sif or any of the Warriors 3, in my opinion. And she brings this lighthearted humor. And I just love the way Tessa Thompson acts out Valkyrie in these scenes.
Well, she's essential from a plot perspective, but from a character perspective, specifically from when they meet her through until the ship battle when they're escaping, is when I have the issues.
Sure, I mean, I could see it, but I don't agree. And so here Thor names them the Revengers, which, as I mentioned in an earlier podcast, is from A-Next, a comic book series where the Revengers are actually a supervillain team. And we also get a brief Easter egg where Thor talks about how Loki once turned into a snake and then scared him, which actually happens somewhat in the comics, not like that, but in the comics, Loki has turned into a snake to sneak past Heimdall and to get into Asgard, as well as it is seen that Thor has picked up snakes because he does love snakes.
Yeah, and there is a very big motif in the comics of Loki and snakes just in general.
So we get an escape sequence here where not the slaves, but the prisoners with jobs are revolting, led by Korg, which is kind of a callback to the Planet Hulk comic book. And I thought, Caleb, we get probably the biggest scene between Thor and Loki in the elevator, where they talk about Odin's death. I love the relationship in this movie. I love the story arc Loki goes in this movie, as well as Thor. I think they're both different and separate from all the other times we've seen them, and it works really well.
I agree. I think this is one of the best scenes in the movie, where they're in the elevator, and then when they get out of the elevator and they do get help, and then Loki betrays Thor, and everybody's like, oh, come on. When is Loki going to stop betraying Thor, and when is Thor going to stop falling for it? But he doesn't fall for it. He saw this. He sees through it, and that shows growth for Thor as a character that I think is very important to show that he's not always behind his brother, and that his brother's not always smarter than him, and he just leaves him there, which is kind of cold.
But I think it works because in the elevator, Thor states that he always wanted to be like this really well-bonded brother with Loki, but he has finally understood that they're just going to be separate, and that's okay. And so we get this chase scene where the Revengers, minus Loki, are able to go through the devil's anus. And Caleb, I don't know if this is the same to you, but for me, when Topez's ship is destroyed and breaks up, it kind of looks pod racing-esque from Star Wars The Phantom Menace, where it kind of lands and then starts spinning. I don't know if you got that feeling, but I certainly did.
I didn't, but I can totally see what you're saying. But I like this scene. It's a good scene. And they end up making it through the portal.
And they finally arrive at Asgard.
Now, there's a couple shots in here that we're not going to go into specifics on. But I do have one question, Zach. Thor brings Valkyrie this costume, this suit that is the Valkyrie suit. He says he found it in the armory area. What are the chances that they still have these? Like, it doesn't really make sense when you think about it.
I mean, I'm sure they actually do have them hidden somewhere in the vault. They have a lot of stuff in this vault. We don't know how big the room is, so plot devices. I don't think it really matters.
But ultimately, Thor does go up to the throne, and he's calling Hela by hitting the staff down on the thing. Basically what Odin was doing. But this is foreshadowing his coronation and becoming king. He's sitting on the throne. It's showing progression from the first Thor movie where he didn't want the throne, and from the second Thor movie where he still didn't want the throne. And now he's starting to recognize the idea that he wants it, or that he is at least willing to take it.
And this takes place after Hela and Scourge have found all the Asgardian citizens who are hiding with Heimdall. And so Hela makes her way back to the throne room as Scourge takes the undead to the bridge to trap all the Asgardians who are trying to cross it. So we have a couple fight scenes here, the first of those being the throne room with Hela versus Thor.
Yeah, and this is a pretty intense fight. Thor ultimately ends up losing an eye.
Which is a shocker. I was astonished when this happened. I couldn't believe it. For like the next 10 minutes, I'm like, oh, he's going to get it back. Oh, this is something that's like, they're going to retcon or whatever. They're going to use magic to bring it back. But no, he loses an eye. Like Carl Grimes, it is gone.
Yeah, and, you kept wondering if they were going to bring it back as magic. I wasn't actually sure he ever lost it. And I this comes back to my issue with this, is the PG-13 rating holds this film back. Because the makeup for his eye doesn't make sense. So once she hits it, his eye is always closed, and it doesn't look like he lost an eye. It just looks like it's bruised. Maybe it has a little bit of blood on it. There's no scar there. There's no scab there. I look specifically in the after the credits scene of this film. He has a scar that starts above his eyebrow and goes below his eyebrow on the eye patch. That is not present here at the end of the fight anywhere. And so I wasn't even sure he actually lost his eye, and I don't think it makes sense from a continuity perspective.
I mean, I see why they do it from a character development story arc. You're right, the PG-13 does hold it back. They couldn't have made this movie R, nor would they ever make it R. And so I see why. I thought they did as well as they could with the resources and the rating they had. But I definitely get that.
I just would have liked to see maybe, like, I don't need to see the socket without the eye. I just need a scar that goes from above the eyebrow down to below the eye. It doesn't have to be graphic, just something there, so there's some sense of continuity, and the fact that it actually was taken. Because even if the eye was taken, I don't think that's how it would look around it. It's just odd.
And so while that's happening, on the bridge, we get a battle here where we got the wolf, Fenrir, and the undead... Or Fenris, correct. Who are attacking the Asgardians from one side, where we have Scourge the Executioner and the undead attacking the Asgardians from the other side. And so Valkyrie and Bruce Banner fly in to try to stop the wolf. They can't. And so in a callback to the 2008 Hulk movie, Bruce Banner jumps from the plane and smacks straight down on the Bifrost and does not turn into the Hulk. Which, Caleb, proves our point that back in 2008, when Edward Norton jumped from the airplane and landed in the rubble, he did not transform into the Hulk until a little bit after.
That's true. I still don't think that makes sense, but that's what they did.
It's funny. it's hilarious.
It is funny because it subverts our expectations. And so they do have a battle here, but while this battle is going on, I mean, there's not too many important things going on here, except the Asgardians are trying to escape. We do jump back to that Hela versus Thor fight, and Thor has another vision of Odin.
Where he learns that Asgard is not a place, it's a people.
And, we kind of talked about this earlier in the film, that I was wondering how this worked, and you said that he's just coming from the, I guess, Valhalla and talking to Thor. But this is actually very similar to what we get in Black Panther, which we'll talk about next week, where they go into the ancestral plane.
Yeah, it really is. What works for this movie? Odin here communicates that, no, he is not as strong as Odin, he is stronger, and that he doesn't need a hammer, which I kind of fully awakens Thor's lightning powers, where he shoots down a massive thunderbolt against Hela and then jumps down to the bridge and cue the Immigrant song, which I think is a great tie-in. We heard it at the first Thor battle, and we hear it now at the last Thor battle. So it puts a nice bow in tying this movie all together. I love how they use the song here in this movie.
Yeah, now that he's on the bridge, I don't remember if it's here or before he gets here, but Korg and Loki end up showing up. Korg showed up and saved Loki when he was on the ground with the Obedient Disc, and they come back here to help save Asgard.
That's right. And so the Asgardians all board the ship that Korg and Meek and the Loki were able to capture. And then on the bridge, as they have defeated all the undead, Hela comes back, and we see we have the Avengers minus the Hulk, who has been battling Fenris in the water. Now, Caleb, in the movie, there's an 8-bit sequence that changes some of this.
Yes, that's a special feature on the Blu-ray. They ended up making an 8-bit sequence kind of top-down of all the events that happen at the end here, just so they can keep track of where everybody is and what's going on. But as you mentioned, the events that take place in that 8-bit sequence vary from what we actually get in the film. Some things are switched, some things aren't quite happening at the same time.
For example, Hulk, after he defeats Fenris, should have jumped back onto the bridge, which in the trailers for the marketing of this movie, we saw all the Revengers together. In the movie, the Hulk never jumps back on the bridge until after they have defeated Hela for the second time. I wish they would have had all of them together, but I think it works.
Yeah, and so with the ship here, they start getting all of the Asgardians onto the ship to get away, and we've got this battle. Scourge initially tries to leave on the ship and then decides to help save it by jumping off of it and shooting all of the undead. And Thor realizes that the only way that they can beat Hela is by destroying Asgard, because I guess that's where her power comes from. And so they come up with this plan to reignite Surtur using the Eternal Flame.
That's right. And in Scourge's death, that's much like the comics. It was also very Doom-esque when he's jumping down with the two guns in this plane of, undead. So he dies like he does in the comics. And Loki goes back to the throne room to get Surtur's mask and ignite him to cause Ragnarok. Before he does that, he does grab the Tesseract.
That's right. We don't actually see him do that, but he looks at it. And we have seen in the Infinity War trailers that he does have it, so he did end up grabbing it. And there's also a callback around here where he's talking to Thor and he says, "This is madness." In the first Thor movie, at the end fight scene, Thor tells Loki, "This is madness." And Loki is like, "Is it? Is it?" And in this film, we get the reverse of that, where Loki is saying it's madness. And Thor is like, "Well, we gotta do it anyway."
So as they defeat Hela for the second time, ignite Surtur, and leave, we see, the Hulk trying to stop Surtur unsuccessfully, as well as Hela trying to stop Surtur, who she is unable to stop him as he destroys Asgard. And as we're panning out, we see that the Asgardians and our heroes are flying away, as Korg talks about how the foundations of the planet are still there and may once, and then it's destroyed.
Yeah, and it's not going to be anything anymore.
But Caleb, you had some gripes about this, correct?
Did I?
Well, originally when it came out, I said that this was probably one of the best scenes, funny moments with Korg, and you hated it because you thought it should be more sorrowful, kind of like in Guardian of the Galaxies 2 with the funeral of Yondu, but instead it's turned into a humorous moment.
I could see myself saying that. I don't remember that. I think I've come to terms with what this film is. I talked about in Thor: The Dark World how I wish that the tone of that film had carried through, and I still do. I actually think what I really want is the tone of the first battle with Surtur and that area. If we could have a film like that, I'm not saying I want it to replace this film. I wish we could have both, right? I wish we could have adventures in that setting. I wish we could have adventures in this setting. And so now I've come to terms with this. I do think this film has issues with the dramatic moments, and I'll talk about that more at the end, but like when Odin dies and when this happens, it's played for laughs, which is okay, but I think you do eventually have to come to terms with what's happened, or else it feels like nothing matters.
And so at our ending, we see that Thor has an eye patch, kind of like Odin, and he finally gets his coronation, which has been kind of his story arc since we first seen him in Thor 1. He is now the ruler of Asgard, who are a group of people, not a place.
Yeah, and as he takes the throne, we get the music from the first Thor movie, tying it all back together. And as you said, this really is fitting. This really is nice. It puts a bow on the trilogy of films. It makes them feel cohesive, even though this film is so much different than the other two. And also what's interesting is Loki seems okay with this. He doesn't want to rule these people now. He's okay with Thor taking the king spot. And
as they ask Korg where to go, they end up headed to Earth, which in the comics, Asgard actually is on Earth for a little bit.
And cue credits, where we get a couple of end-credit scenes.
The first one tying directly into Infinity War, as Loki and Thor are talking, and we see the massive ship.
the Sanctuary 2,
which is the ship of Thanos and his Black Order.
That's right. It comes up here and they're like, oh no. And we actually get a different Thor costume here, Zach. I don't know if you noticed. This is not the costume he wore during Ragnarok. This is a black costume, and this is the one that he's going to be wearing during Infinity War.
I do have a question about this, Caleb. We do know that Waititi has stated that we will see Korg, Valkyrie, possibly Heimdall again. Yet in the Infinity War trailer, we see a bunch of Asgardians dead and Loki presumably presenting the Tesseract to Thanos. So what do you think happens to that group? Do they die? Do they escape? Question marks.
I doubt they die. They probably get on some escape pod or something and go off somewhere else. I mean, there's numerous ways they could handle that. Obviously, we don't really know what's going to happen. The only person we see there that we know, aside from the villains, is Loki. So maybe Loki goes and gives this up in order for the others to escape.
And in our last end credit scene, it's a funny snippet from Sakaar, where the Grandmaster calls it a tie between him and the revolutionaries.
Yeah, you say funny. I guess it's funny. I don't think it's that funny. Definitely not worth waiting through the credits for.
Well, originally he was actually supposed to be a stowaway on the Asgardian ship, but Waititi apparently changed that at the end and just decided him to crash land back in Sakaar for this funny little tidbit at the end.
Yeah, and all of this was ad-libbed as well. They shot many, many different things that he said, and this is what they picked. So I guess you get what you get when you ad-lib.
And that is the great movie of Thor, Ragnarok. So Caleb, how did this movie do domestically, commercially, critically, overseas, and all the above?
Well, this was released November 3rd of 2017 with a budget of $180 million, and it had a worldwide gross of $738 million with a 410% return. That makes it the highest grossing Thor movie out of the trilogy. Currently, it's sitting at a 92% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is very high, and a 73 on Metacritic, which is, about average for a higher film. It was nominated for 20 awards. It won one of those, but there are still 3 pending, so we're not quite sure what's going to happen with those yet.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it did very, very well, even though it was such a different take. People seem to really embrace this, and I think that if there is another Thor film, which Chris Hemsworth has said he's open to doing, and Taika has said he's open to doing, it will probably be in the same vein as this.
Which definitely leads into the legacy. I thought this movie has a lot going for it in its legacy. It continues from that's what we talked about in our Spider-Man podcast, that there really can no longer be a solo outing. This was Thor, but it had Doctor Strange as well as the Hulk heavily in this movie. It also carries over that humorous Marvel tone, which I think we will not get in Infinity War. It'll be a lot more serious, like the Winter Soldier, but still it carries kind of this humor that we've seen in the Marvel movies.
Yeah, and I think that this is the first film that you could really say is Marvel's comedy film, right? All of their films have comedy. There's some that lean more on comedy than others, Guardians especially. Ant-Man is another one. But I wouldn't call those films comedies. They're action comedies. This film, I would almost call it a straight-up comedy because it is so ingrained in everything that happens. And so I think that that's interesting that they're leaning into that more. But it's not a bad thing, as you said. Now, also, this sets up Infinity War in several ways. First of all, the Tesseract being with Loki, and also, we've seen in the trailers, as we mentioned, Loki's handing over the Tesseract to Thanos. So this also kind of serves as a way to close off that relationship. In the first Avengers film, Loki was supposed to give him the Tesseract. He never did. Infinity War, he's going to, but that wouldn't be possible without this film. So this film also really helps set the stage for that, as well as close out this trilogy as a whole.
Yeah, that's correct. And Caleb, we have heard that the Russo brothers and Kevin Feige have stated that Thanos in Infinity War sets himself up as the biggest Marvel villain in like the first, 5 minutes maybe?
Mm-hmm.
And so, sadly, I am going to predict that Loki will die here. Thor and Hulk would get separated, and a lot of the Asgardians will die. But if this is Loki's death, which it probably will be in the movie, I'm okay with that, because I thought that he has had a great storyline in the MCU.
Yeah, I talked about in Thor the Dark World how I would have been okay with him dying there because it was a good ending for him. And same thing for Infinity War. I am totally down with him dying so long as it's done in a great way.
And I don't know if you checked out on the Blu-ray, but they also had a really, really well done snippet of 10 years of the evolution of heroes where they walk through all the Marvel heroes, Caleb. I want to watch that before going into Infinity War because it's so well done looking at just the road that leads, from Iron Man to the present.
I agree. It was very nice. Very good to see. They've done another one since then, I think, that they released online that's different. And so I'm glad that they're embracing the fact that this is their 10th anniversary.
So with that wrapped up, Caleb, what is your ultimate ranking of Thor Ragnarok, the 17th movie in the MCU?
So, Zach, I did really like this movie. I think it did take me some time to come around to the comedy elements of it for the entire film, because I do think there are some things that should have been a bit more dramatic that weren't. I think that this film shines in its fights and in its comedy. It's these dramatic elements that I'm saying are missing that I think it doesn't do so well. Some of them are good. For example, the Thor-Loki conversation on the elevator, I think that's great and it's dramatic. There's a little bit of comedy in there, but it's perfect. But overall, the drama in this film is not the best. I do think that Valkyrie probably could have been cut from this film. While I do enjoy her character in a lot of the film, there are times where it just doesn't need to be there, and the really only reason that she's here is for plot reasons. She doesn't do much as a character outside of helping Thor get off the planet, helping Thor beat them at the end. They could have figured out a different way to do that with a different character or something, and so I think that could have been improved. This is the first Marvel movie with a female villain, which I think was great, but I think that she was kind of wasted. This really is a Planet Hulk style movie. The Ragnarok storyline is sidelined. I think that's a mistake to do it if you're going to sideline it that way. And so these are things that I wish could have been better. So when I look at my list, this is a really good film. This is probably, I would say, in the upper portion of my list. But I don't think it's as complete as Iron Man or as complete as Spider-Man, but I think it might be more entertaining than, say, a Doctor Strange. So that's exactly where I'm going to put it. I have Iron Man and Doctor Strange currently sitting at number 7 and number 8, and I'm going to sandwich it in between them at my new number 8 spot. So from number 1 all the way down to number 17, my list is Captain America the Winter Soldier, Captain America Civil War, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1, The Avengers, Spider-Man Homecoming, Iron Man 1, Thor Ragnarok at number 8, Doctor Strange at number 9, Thor 1 at number 10, and then Avengers Age of Ultron, Thor the Dark World, Captain America the First Avenger, Ant-Man, The Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 3, and Iron Man 2. What are your thoughts, Zach?
All right, so the number 8 spot for you. Caleb, there is a lot to love in this movie. I love the completion of Loki's story arc. I love the completion of Thor's story arc, as well as the new direction both characters went in. I thought the interaction between both characters was amazing. The humor here, Caleb, the humor is so good with Korg, with Thor, with Loki, with all the characters in it. I love Waititi's style and direction with the entire movie. I like the incorporation of the Hulk storyline, this Planet Hulk storyline. I mean, yeah, I wish we could get a solo Planet Hulk movie. We never will. This will be kind of the extent of what we get, but I think it was done really well, especially with this Ragnarok side of it as, integrating both kind of storylines into this movie. It's a fast-paced movie. You turn it on, you watch it, and you stick with it. There's no parts that lull until the end, at least for me. It's a fun, it's an entertaining movie. When I think about maybe what's negative or what's lacking in this movie, I agree with some of what you said. Yeah, there could have maybe been more emotional, dramatic parts, but I think the emotional, dramatic parts it delivers, such as Odin's death, is good enough. I thought it could have been more emotional with the loss of Thor's eye, as that kind of really changes his character, but for the most part, it's good. So where do I put this in my list of movies? Definitely way above number 8. This beats out The Avengers, which was in my number 3, which means I now have to slot this in my top 3. Number 1's Captain America Civil War, and number 2 is Captain America the Winter Soldier. So is this better than one of those Captain Americas? It's not as good as Captain America Civil War with all the heroes. And to be honest, compared to Winter Soldier, I'm going to shift depending on the day and the mood, right? Because Thor Ragnarok is more of a humorous comedy versus Captain America the Winter Soldier is more of a serious tone. However, at the end of the day, I would probably rather watch Thor Ragnarok than Captain America the Winter Soldier, which means Thor Ragnarok has entered into my number 2 spot. Meaning my list of movies is now Captain America the Civil War, number 1, Thor Ragnarok is number 2, Captain America the Winter Soldier is 3, The Avengers is 4, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1 is 5, Spider-Man Homecoming is 6, Iron Man is 7, Ant-Man is 8, Captain America is 9, Doctor Strange is 10, and then rounding off the last 7 would be Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is 11, Age of Ultron is 12, Thor 2 is 13, Thor is 14, Iron Man 2 is 15, Incredible Hulk is 16, and Iron Man 3 as 17. So Thor Ragnarok has definitely outpaced its other incantations, whatever. It's definitely outpassed the other Thor movies in my list.
That's very interesting, Zach. You know, as I'm sitting here thinking about the missed opportunity of the things that we would have liked to see in this movie, I'm kind of wondering, it would be nice if Marvel would do some movies outside of the MCU, so they could do some of these, like, Planet Hulk movies if they ever got the full rights back.
That would be awesome. Well, Caleb, you know who I do know is starting his own revolution, but hopefully he has handed out enough pamphlets.
Taylor Poole?
Taylor Poole is correct. Shout out to our friend Taylor Poole, who has done our awesome intro and outro music for our podcast. Check out his music and revolution at taylorpoolemusic.com. That's TaylorPoole music.com.
And also, while you're waiting for our next episode to come out, check out our friends over at CNC Power Hour. They stream Magic the Gathering and video games throughout the week on Twitch. That's C Power Hour.
And lastly, go check out our website, causewe'renerds.com. Send your friends, your coworkers, your family members, and let them know that we release a podcast every Friday for your listening pleasure. Thanks for listening to 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Thor Ragnarok. We would love to hear your comments or feedback at causewe'renerds@gmail.com. That's CUZWERENERDS@gmail.com. Or you can leave us a review on iTunes or on Facebook. You can also follow us on social media at Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or any other major social network or podcasting sites. Join us next week as we cover the final movie on the road to Infinity War, Black Panther. How well did Black Panther connect to the events of Civil War? Does this solo outing fall into the same pitfalls of its predecessors, or is it unique? And how does this movie set us up for the epic Avengers Infinity War? Find out these answers and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, Black Panther. Stay nerdy. Because another person who did that was
Mark Ruffalo.
Yeah, I'm like, Bruce Banner. What's his name? Oh yeah, Mark Ruffalo, not Edward Norton.